All right, class, we are going to start on the last subunit of the semester. So remember, last unit's a big unit, so it's helpful to think of it in terms of first subunit on the cosmological arguments, second subunit on the design arguments, third one on the problem of evil. So today, we're going to be talking generally about the problem of evil, which is really, believe it or not, we're actually following part 10 of the dialogues. It's just that a lot of this terminology and precision didn't exist during Hume's time, although he's actually one of the people who really figured out a lot of logistics. So we will do the Hume part 10, which closely follows what we call the logical problem of evil. We'll do Hume part 11, which closely follows what we call the evidential problem of evil. The last lecture, we'll talk about some attempted solutions in theodicies, which we'll certainly set up that terminology earlier so you know what a theodicy is. But then also during that last lecture is when we'll be bringing up the Dostoevsky. That's going to be the order. So let's start with the basic setup for the problem of evil, and this stuff is important. So certainly post any questions you have, etc. Generally, at its most basic, the problem of evil comes from a tension between three things. Those three things are omnipotence, moral perfection, and evil or suffering. So we're going to say more about each of those to make it a little more precise. So first of all, remember we mentioned omnipotence before, but an omnipotent being is an all-powerful being. Much more precisely, an omnipotent being is a being that can do anything that is logically possible. So, roughly speaking, if you could imagine it, an omnipotent being could do it. Now, some people don't like that definition. They think it's somehow impious or problematic for the definition of omnipotence that God can't break a law of logic. So God couldn't make 2 + 2 = 5, etc. So, first of all, trust me, you want that in place, because if God could break a law of logic, any talk about God has no meaning anymore. For instance, suppose you could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's a God who exists that is also morally perfect. Well, if that being could break a law of logic, you can't infer from the fact that that being is morally perfect that that being's also not perfectly evil. Because a God who could break a law of logic could be good and evil at the same time. And so you can't draw any meaningful conclusions about a being if we throw the logic out the window. So it's undesirable for that reason. But second, as we're going to see, capping God's power at what is logically possible actually is the only way to get to a solution to the problem of evil. So whether you like it or lump it, just realize the working definition of omnipotence is able to bring about any logically possible state of affairs. God could do anything but break a law of logic. Moral perfection. So older texts sometimes say omnibenevolence. That's not the word. Moral perfection means two things together: never blameworthy, always praiseworthy. Another way of saying that is maximally praiseworthy. So that's what it would mean for a being to be morally perfect. So notice the God of theism we introduced at the beginning of the unit is a being who is both omnipotent and morally perfect, and that is that being's description. Not saying that being exists or doesn't. So, notice the problem of evil is particularly a problem for anybody who's a theist in the technical sense, capital T, theism. Third thing that causes a problem here is evil. Now, when we're talking about evil and the problem of evil, what we mean by that definition is just any suffering. So it doesn't have to be mwahaha evil. Just any suffering at all, including things like cancer and even bad headaches, any headaches, would count as evil in this sense. The word evil is somewhat misleading. A lot of contemporary philosophers of religion will just talk about suffering now, but since this is an intro course and we're reading classical texts and you might be doing some Googling on the side, we'll stick to the classical terminology, but just realize evil means any suffering. And we'll see why in I guess right now. So, um, in terms of praise and blame, if, say, you see me about to stub my toe really bad on a coffee table, and you have it in your power to warn me, and you don't, it seems like you did something blameworthy because you could have prevented that suffering. So the reason evil is defined in terms of suffering is it's the kind of thing that a good being would seek to prevent. Just to finish out the terminology, I'm going to give you two types of evil. This won't even become relevant until we talk about solutions. But just to get it out of the way now, we can talk about moral evil and natural evil. So moral evil is suffering whose immediate cause is agency. That is someone's intent, some being decided to cause harm. So suffering caused by getting punched in the face, or the suffering caused by murder or rape, those kind of things, are all what we call moral evil. The rest is what we call natural evil, evil whose is just suffering that is not immediately caused by agency. So cancer and headaches, assuming someone's headache isn't caused by someone getting punched. Tornadoes, COVID-19, these are all things that we call natural evil, not caused by intent. So again, that's not super relevant now. But it will become relevant when we talk solutions on the third part of the problem of evil lectures. So those are the three. Now, we can start to see a tension, as Hume says in the text. What of Epicurus' old riddle? The general idea is an omnipotent being has the power to prevent all suffering. A morally perfect being has the motive to prevent all suffering. Which means, if there's suffering, there's not a being who's both omnipotent and morally perfect, or so the logical problem goes. Very roughly. That's a very, very rough approximation. We're going to need to add a bunch of precision to it, but that's enough to see the tension. And we're going to have to spend some time developing the problem. And it's very common with the problem of evil. Students just want to try to skip the problem entirely and start talking about solutions. We can't. Until we actually fully appreciate and understand with precision what the problem is, we don't even know what a solution would look like. And so I encourage you, don't try to solve the problem before we've articulated the problem. It's a very common mistake, not going to be helpful. So let's start to articulate the problem. The second thing we have to ask ourselves is, when is someone blameworthy for allowing suffering? So notice I said someone. So for now, we're going to talk about basic ethics, you and me ethics. So don't need to bring God into it at all. So am I always blameworthy for allowing suffering I could have prevented? Of course not. So here's a couple of simple examples. Well, I, as an instructor, have to do this pesky thing called grading. And some of that grading involves assigning poor grades, and I know that the assigning of those poor grades causes my students to suffer. So, am I blameworthy for that? Is that the kind of thing that I do something morally wrong for assigning a poor grade? It doesn't seem like it. Or, to take another example, one of my least favorite days is the days that my daughter has to get vaccinated. It causes her some suffering. She gets pain in the arm, and she's upset, and da-da-da-da, and it's just gut-wrenching to watch. Am I blameworthy for allowing that suffering? Again, it doesn't seem like it. What are these common cases? A first approximation might be, you might say something like, well, I, Mickey Lurkowski, am not blameworthy for allowing suffering I could have prevented when when that suffering is necessary to achieve a greater good, such as my daughter not catching one of these terrible diseases that the vaccinations protect against. Or you might think in terms of education, why it's a greater good that I have to assign some negative grades when those negative grades are merited, and how that's a good thing in the long run. But we haven't said enough yet, and I guarantee we haven't said enough yet, because suffering comes in degrees. So suppose instead I went to get my daughter vaccinated, and the doctor says, okay, well, the vaccine's going to work either way, but would you like us to use the smaller, less painful child needle or the large adult needle that hurts a lot more? And I said, go ahead and use the adult needle. Have I done something wrong there? Clearly, very, very, very clearly have I done something wrong, even though her getting poked with the big adult needle would still be much better than her getting some of these diseases. And so that shows that we can't just say, I'm allowed to allow suffering as long as it's necessary for a greater good or contributes to a greater good. We have to say something more. And the difference there that this example is supposed to bring out is what we need to say is, when am I, Mickey Lorkowski, not blameworthy? Not just when the suffering contributes to a greater good, but when it is the least suffering, when it is the minimum suffering that contributes to a greater good. That's when I'm not blameworthy, because I'm clearly blameworthy if I use the bigger needle. So notice that's true for anybody. Anybody is not blameworthy for allowing suffering as long as that suffering is the minimum that is necessary for obtaining some greater good. And I like to think that my grading and my teaching are that kind as well, that I only assign the poor grades when it's necessary and the minimum pain necessary to achieve a greater good, such as quality education in a certain way along with student accountability. Set that aside. Anyway, so what is true for anyone? They are not blameworthy of suffering when it is the minimum suffering that is necessary to bring about a greater good. Now for the hard part. Shift that basic moral thing we've just learned about blame and apply it to an omnipotent being, because things are a little different. Because here's a funny thing. Suppose that I, as a father, could wave a magic wand and just make my daughter immune to all those diseases. Well, if I have that magic wand, then clearly I'm blameworthy in giving her the shot instead. And yet God has the magic wand. And so we're going to do a double thing. First of all, we're going to take this basic precept of ethics and blame and apply it to an omnipotent being, which is going to change things a tiny bit. But then we're going to see how that has ramifications for what a solution to the problem of evil might look like. So, coffee break. God can do anything but break a law of logic, which means God can prevent most evil in certain senses. So we're going to give an official definition of a necessary evil and gratuitous evil. So, and we're going to define it in terms of praise and blame of whether an omnipotent being would be praiseworthy and blameworthy. A necessary evil is one that would be logically entailed by a greater good. That is the minimum that is logically entailed, I should say, by a greater good. And those are the kind of things that even an omnipotent being could not prevent. Now, we don't have to say there are or aren't necessary evils in this way, but that's the definition. So the minimum suffering that is logically entailed by a greater good. Though I don't want to talk about solutions until next week, it might help to kind of introduce one a little bit, because You might be wondering, well, how in the world can suffering be logically entailed by a greater good? Alvin Plantinga gives what he calls the free will defense. The general claim is that there is this greater good called morally significant free will. He doesn't say that any free will is a greater good, so certainly my freedom to choose between tuna packed in water and tuna packed in oil is not the kind of freedom that is morally significant, that we should, make huge sacrifices and let people die over, that kind of thing. But by contrast, morally significant free will, says Plantinga, only occurs when we have the ability to choose between right and wrong, between making a morally correct choice and a morally incorrect choice. That's what separates us from the animals, etc. So, start with that definition, that morally significant free will is such that it requires the ability to choose between right and wrong. But, says Plantinga, that means that even God, with an omnipotence one, even an omnipotent being, could not give us morally significant free will without also giving us the ability to choose wrong. And so that's what it would mean for a greater good to logically entail suffering. That even God with an omnipotence wand could not give one without the other. So that would be a necessary evil. Gratuitous evil, by contrast, is everything else. Gratuitous evil, very important concept, cannot understand the problem of evil without understanding the concept of gratuitous evil. Wink. Might come up again. But gratuitous evil is any suffering more than is necessary. That is, gratuitous evil is any suffering more than the minimum that is logically entailed by a greater good. Now, why is gratuitous evil so important, such that it might come up again on an exam? Because we now have made things precise enough to say the following. Gratuitous evil, and only gratuitous evil, is blameworthy because it's more than is necessary. Which means, since any gratuitous evil is blameworthy, and a God of theism would be always praiseworthy, never blameworthy, what follows is that if one exists, the other does not. So God's existence is not incompatible with evil. God's existence is incompatible with gratuitous evil. If there is a God of theism, there is no gratuitous evil. If there is gratuitous evil, there is no God of theism. Those two do not play nicely together. So now we've gotten to a point where we're specific enough to understand what the problem of evil really is. The problem of evil is about gratuitous evil. We would not blame a being for allowing necessary evil, but we would blame them for allowing gratuitous evil. More suffering than is logically entailed by a greater good. All right, so now those are the basics. Definitely no gratuitous evil. We're now going to apply those to the logical problem of evil and versus evidential problem of evil distinction. All right. Both problems have various forms, so let's talk about the commonality. The logical problem of evil is a deductive a posteriori argument that intends to show that because there is evil, there is no God. Well, using our new terminology, that is to say that the presence of evil entails that some evil is gratuitous. So what might that look like? If I were giving the argument in premise form, and feel free to pause and do this as necessary so you could write it down, it would be something like, if there is a God of theism, there is no gratuitous evil. At least some evil is gratuitous, therefore there is no God of theism. For instance, many people think that any evil is gratuitous, which would trivially make the second premise true. So, that's the argument. Let's use our argument evaluation apparatus. Deductive or inductive? Of course it's deductive, it's a hypothetical. Valid or invalid? Remember, that's an issue of inference. Theists and atheists alike are going to both agree that that argument is valid. Try it with the counterexample method. The form is if A then B, if A then not B, B therefore not A. Perfectly valid form, which means, of course, the whole romp is whether it's sound. So, here's an interesting point. Premise 1, if there is a God of theism, there is no gratuitous evil. That's actually conceptually true, which means theists and atheists alike are going to have to agree that premise 1 is true. It is true by definition, which means the whole discussion is premise 2, whether there is any gratuitous evil. A theist must say, if they're going to say a theist, they must say that the argument is unsound, which means they must say that even though it's valid and premise 1 is true, they have to reject premise 2. So, every theist, in the technical sense of theism, every theist must say there is no gratuitous evil. There has never been a single case of gratuitous evil ever. So, every theist must say that. And the question is, of course, how they say that or whether we should say that. Let me say a few more things about the logical problem. First of all, I stated it as kind of basic, but really there's an implied modal claim. The claim is that some evil must be gratuitous. Because the logical problem asserts that the very premise of evil, the very presence of evil entails there is no God of theism. What would it take to solve that? So you might want to start a section in your notes on solutions to the logical problem of evil. First of all, in terms of terminology, a solution is called a defense if you're trying to solve the logical problem of evil. But the logical problem of evil basically says that since there's evil, it's impossible that there's a God of theism. So to solve it, and what a defense must do, is only to show that God is possible given evil. Put another way, the goal of a solution to the logical problem of evil is to show that it's possible that all evil is necessary and that no evil is gratuitous. If you've done that, you've shown that it's possible that the God of theism exists given actual evil, and that's all it takes to solve the logical problem. I say that's all it takes. That's a lot, but and that's okay. There are even some atheists who have actually think that the logical problem has been solved. What does that tell you? That the logical problem isn't that important. In fact, if you check out the end of Hume Part 10, you'll see how Hume feels about the logical problem. What's Hume's position? Basically, he thinks the logical problem works. He thinks the presence of evil entails there is no God of theism, and yet he's willing to just stipulate that there is a solution to the logical problem. He doesn't even care. Why? Because a solution of the problem, logical problem of evil just means that the God's existence is possible. But what's possible doesn't fix your belief. It's possible my arm's going to turn off and fall off and turn into a flying chinchilla. And so it's for dialectical purposes. Hume just says, let's just stipulate there's a solution to the logical problem and move on to the real issue, which is the evidential problem. So let me read you that passage. Sorry, my book's still locked up at Kent State Trumbull, so I can't give you a page number. But here's what Hume says in the second to last paragraph. Philo says, "But I will be contented to retire still from this retrenchment, that is, the logical problem of evil. For I deny that you could ever force me in it. He does not think the logical problem can be solved. But, nevertheless, he says, I will allow that pain or misery in man is compatible with infinite power and goodness in the deity. So I will grant that it's possible that that all of this evil is necessary. What are you advanced by all these concessions? A mere possible compatibility is not sufficient, for you must prove these pure and unmixed, uncontrollable attributes from the present mixed and confused phenomena." And so that's Hume's position at the end of Part 10. I think the logical problem wins, says Hume. I think that any evil is in a sense gratuitous, and therefore the evil renders the impossibility of the God of theism. And yet, I don't care that much. Why? Because we never form our beliefs on what is possible. We always form our beliefs on what is probable. So this is going to lead to the evidential problem of evil. So let me state the general form of the evidential problem, and then we're going to break so you can go read part 11. The evidential problem is inductive. Still needs an a posteriori premise that there's suffering. So here's a way you can state the evidential problem of evil. That premise 1, the same. That if there is a God of theism, then there is no gratuitous evil. New premise 2, though. Some evil is probably gratuitous. Conclusion, therefore there is probably no God of theism. So if one probably exists, the other probably does not. Deductive or inductive? Of course it's inductive due to an inference based on probability. Strong or weak? Of course it is strong. For the same inferential reasons, theists and atheists alike are going to have to grant that that argument is strong, which means when we ask cogent or uncogent is the whole discussion here. Well, once more, premise 1 is a conceptual truth, true by definition. The theist is not going to get anywhere by trying to deny premise 1. Instead, if I am to remain a theist, I have to deny premise 2, and that's the only way to deny the conclusion. That means I have to say, if I am a theist, I have to say there is probably no gratuitous evil. Once more, not saying anything theists and atheists disagree about. But let me tell you 3 things that are the equivalent of saying there's probably no gratuitous evil. So, every theist must say there is probably no gratuitous evil. Otherwise, they can't be a theist. But this is the same as saying, to say there's probably no gratuitous evil is to say this is probably the best possible world. Those two are equivalent. To say that there is probably no gratuitous evil is to say that God, removing or reducing any instance of suffering, would probably make the world a worse place. Again, that's the same as saying there's probably no gratuitous evil. Lastly, to say there's probably no gratuitous evil is to say this is the amount of suffering we would expect from a perfect creation. So, let me remind you of that again. The theist, to remain a theist, must say there's probably no gratuitous evil. This is the same as saying this is probably the best possible world, that God reducing suffering would probably make the world worse in some way, and that this amount of evil is expected in a perfect creation. So, because the theist must say the first, they must say the other 3. Now let's start talking about those 3 just a little bit. So first of all, Hume is going to draw out those 3 theistic commitments with analogies. Watch for the builder/architect analogy. Watch for the visitor analogy. And watch for the 4 circumstances that lead to most suffering. Hume is going to use these 3 to do 2 things. 1, to draw out what the theist must be committed to, as we just talked about, but also 2, to try to convince you, the reader, that you shouldn't share that commitment. If you don't think this is probably the best possible world, then you're not a theist. So that's what the second Hume reading is going to do. But let's talk about solutions to the problem of evil for now, just a little bit. A solution to the problem of evil, terminologically, is called a theodicy. So defense is an attempted solution to the logical problem. A theodicy is an attempted solution to the evidential problem. What is their job? The theist has to say those 3 things. The job of a theodicy is to try to convince you that you would want to say those 3 things, that those 3 things are not as bizarre as they might seem at first. And so that's how they kind of try to take the teeth out of the evidential problem. So we will talk much more on the evidential problem in the next video, and then we'll spend a whole video talking about theodicies. But again, Do not try to solve the problem before you understand the problem. So we're going to do the second Hume reading next, and then we'll turn to the theodicies at the end of the semester with some help from Dostoevsky for us to understand what a theodicy would need to look like. Otherwise, keep up on the discussion boards, and we will see you next time.